Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Elastoplast's taping and movement series. So week 4, session 7. My name's Simon Rice. I'm the head physio at the Plus 500 Brumbies down in Canberra. So for those who don't know, we play in the Super Rugby competition. And so today, this evening, I'm going to talk about shoulders. So we're going to go through some shoulder prehab and shoulder rehabilitation, and I'll show you how we strap shoulders for training and for games. So there's quite a bit to cover, obviously. So a bit of housekeeping first. I'll keep it under 45 minutes. So I could speak for days about shoulders, I think, and especially with 3 topics to cover with them. But there's a lot of crossover. So I'll go through that. And I'm hoping what you get out of it is some principles to use for shoulders. So I work in rugby at the moment. I've worked in other sports before I held this position. And I'm hoping that some of the principles I can show you around shoulder health, strength, and stability can be transferred to various other sports. And the strapping techniques that I use and we all use at the Brumbies now can be transferred from other sports as well. So a bit of housekeeping first. So I'll keep it to 45 minutes, like I said. On this platform, if you just shoot through your questions in the chat function, which you should see on your screen, we'll save them all to the end, and then I'll read the questions and I'll answer them once I've finished. And if you can just put all your microphones on mute, just so we don't get dogs or children or that in the background, that would be great. Disclaimer, like there always is with these things. So always read the label, follow the instructions for use, and if systems persist, talk to your healthcare professional. So I'll be using Elastoplast, the under wrap, 38mm rigid tape, and EAB, so a non-rippable shoulder tape. But we'll get to those when we get to the shoulder strapping components. The other things, as you know from the other presentations, if you've seen them, any of these products, you can just get them at your local pharmacy or the local sports wholesaler. Also, elastoplast.com, so you can get them all from there. All right. So I think just briefly, the most important place to start with shoulders is shoulder anatomy. And I understand people are coming from different sports, different backgrounds, and different levels of training. But I just want to really quickly cover some shoulder anatomy, because I think if you've got a basic understanding of that, prehab, rehab, and strapping all will kind of make sense. So for those who haven't seen it, that's a shoulder joint. As you can see, that's the top, that's the bottom, this is the outside. So arm bone. So we're specifically talking about the glenohumeral joint, which is the ball and socket joint here. It's got a couple of really important features that we need to know about when we're working into our shoulder programs, and also when we're strapping them for sport. So two of the important things here is it's a ball and socket joint, like I said, but the ball and socket, the surface area is quite low, okay? So similar surface area to a golf ball sitting on a golf tee, which is why we have a lot of range of movement in our shoulder. But the flip side is we have an increased instability in the movement. So if we contrast that to a hip joint, another ball and socket, deep ball and socket joint, not as much movement, but a lot more stability. The other important thing with shoulders is it's got a capsule, like a lot of other joints, that gives some structural support, and it's got some ligaments that reinforce it, but predominantly the muscles that sit around the shoulder are what give it its stability. So most people have heard of rotator cuff muscles, plus some others. They're the ones that give your shoulder the stability it needs. So it's one of the reasons that prehab and rehabilitation with shoulder injuries is strength is fundamentally important, because that's the biggest structure that gives us the support. So we'll go through some of that stuff as well. Now, just a little differentiation with prehab and rehab. So in my mind, prehabilitation is identifying any weakness that we can address that maybe reduces your chance of getting an injury. And then rehabilitation is just slowly progressing from injury back to return to sport. Okay, so we're going to go from the least demanding activity more and more demanding until we get back to the requirements of the sport, whatever that is. And for shoulders, it could be any number of things. So a throwing sport compared to a contact sport, compared to an overused sport like swimming or tennis, the requirements are going to get harder through the rehabilitation. So I think the exercises cross over, but we put them in different ways. So what I want to speak about, I suppose, is 3 different ideas for shoulder prehab and shoulder rehab. So we're going to look at 3 components. We're going to look at strength, we're going to look at stability, and we're going to look at mobility. And I'll show you a couple of exercises that I use in each of those categories, and I'll show you a couple of progressions. So if we talk about strength first, I mentioned that the stability of a shoulder joint is to do with the muscle strength. So it's really important that when we rehabilitate a shoulder, we get a lot of strength in the muscles that support it. So I'll show you some basic exercises here. The other thing I want to mention is the exercises that I use are not probably different to ones people have seen before or maybe used themselves. But I do think that shoulder rehabilitation, how you do the exercises, is really, really important. So I'm going to show you the cues I use and why I put the exercises where I do, because I think in my experience, I see shoulders that maybe didn't rehab as well as they could have, or I see people that have recurrent shoulder injuries by the time they get to me down the track, and one of the reasons the rehabilitation fails is because they didn't do the exercises how the person thought they should be, if that makes sense. So I think more than almost any other joint, how you do shoulder strength is fundamentally important for it to work. So I'll show you that. So once we've got shoulder strength, the next component is shoulder stability. And the difference with shoulder strength and stability is more about the coordination of muscles. So if we think about the shoulder joint and we measure someone, so we have 120 kilo rugby players that have a lot of shoulder strength. If we measure how hard they can push in one direction, they can bend. We've got guys that can bench press 185 kilos, but do they have the stability to use those muscles when they need to in certain positions, to be able to coordinate the muscles, turn them on and off as rapidly as they need to, so their shoulder strength is able to give them stability. So I'll show you a couple of exercises we use for that. And the flip side of that is mobility. So we need enough movement in the shoulder joint to allow us to do what we need to do. So if you think of tennis or you think of swimming again, we need enough mobility to go through the range we need to, and we need to have mobility through the rest of the chain. So one of the common things you see in a lot of sports, but in rugby that I work in at the moment, is guys who are very stiff through their thoracic spine, for example. So their shoulder joint is compromised because they don't have enough range through the rest of their chain to take off some of the load, and then that causes shoulder injuries. So as much as we need to rehabilitate the shoulder, we need to rehabilitate the rest of the kinetic chain. So as an example of that, there's quite a bit of evidence now that in throwing sports like baseball, cricket, that a loss of range of movement of your contralateral hip, so if you're right arm thrower, right arm bowler, your left hip joint, if you have some stiffness in that, you're more likely to get a right shoulder joint problem, because you are not able to follow through as far because of your hip joint, if that makes sense. So I think it's important that we look at mobility through the rest of the chain. So if we go to strength first. So I'm just going to use TheraBand. Everyone will have seen these before. And I'm going to show you, everyone will have seen external rotation strength in a shoulder before. They've probably given it, they've probably done it themselves, and they've probably seen it. But I want to use this because I want to show you how I progress it, but also I want to drive home this point that it's really common that people do external rotator shoulder strength and they're not using their external rotators. So it's really important that if we're trying to strengthen a muscle, which is vitally important for shoulder health, that we're strengthening the muscles we think we are. So there's a couple of key points to this. I always get them to roll up a towel to hold underneath, to hold between the elbow and their rib cage, and it does a couple of things. I think it gets people away from hinging through here, gets them in a more natural shoulder position to allow them to use their strength. Now, the muscles that we're trying to use here actually sit on the back of your shoulder joint, on the back of your shoulder blade. So the other thing that's really important with shoulder anatomy, if we go back to this model very quickly, is, as you can see, it's a joint between, it's an interesting joint because it's got two moving parts. So your arm bone and your shoulder blade is movable as well. So I think it's really important to picture what we need to do is if we've got a piece of string and we want to pull something, we need to be able to fix one end. So in this case, if we can't fix our shoulder blade or move our arm, we can't strengthen the muscle. So we need to be able to control the movement. We need to be able to pinpoint which movement we're trying to do. So towel underneath the arm. Now I think the common things I think I see here again are people seem to be either the shoulder rotated all the way forward, which is going to look like this, or conversely, they're told to squeeze their shoulder blades and they end up in this position, which is not helpful either. So what we want them to be is enough tension to hold the towel, shoulder in a comfortable position, and they're going to imagine it's pure rotation through this bone. Okay, so the rotation movement is if I tell them to picture a skewer going through here all the way to the floor, and it's only rotation. So this hand is fixed and they're rotating, having to keep the towel because the towel also will show you if you start moving your arm away, the towel's going to fall down. So pressure on the towel, 3 seconds. So we're trying to build some muscle strength. So we need some time under tension for these muscles. So I actually get people to go really slowly. 3 seconds out, pause, and come back in. Now, the other thing that's really important with this is we strengthen it through both ways. We have to strengthen muscles as it rotates. We have to get shoulder strength to control the movement back in. And a really good example of that is again, if we look at throwing or rugby, I'll give 2 examples. When we throw a ball, it's obviously internal rotation strength that's really important, but it's also important our muscles at the back are able to slow your arm down in the follow through. If we look at a rugby example, it's really important. When guys tackle, if they're in this position and there's a lot of impact coming forward, they need to be able to slow down the movement. So they need to have the strength to rotate in, but they have to have the strength to slow down the opposite movement. So again, towel underneath, band, or we use a cable machine as well sometimes, just for a different profile. Rotating, 3 seconds, pause, slowly back in. There's a number of ways to progress it. So how I tend to progress it is to start to go through more range. Now, you need to be strong down here, but you need to get strength through range, especially your shoulder strength is very specific. So being strong down here does not mean you're strong up here. And in rugby, you need to be able to tackle with your arm in this position. So we tend to progress it by going from side to 45 degrees. It's really important though that this line of rotation is still coming straight through your arm. So from 45 degrees, and then eventually we'll progress up to 90. Again, the really important thing here is we're concentrating on pure rotation, no movement through a different plane. Another way that's really easy to progress this, especially for home, is to get a longer TheraBand, and I'm just standing on that. Okay, and what that does is it forces you to be in a position that's upwardly rotated. Now, if I'm not, that band's going to slip off. So what it means is it just gives us another cue, so we can have our towel underneath still, give us another cue to hold a good position while we rotate. So that's another progression. So we tend to progress it by adding another load and progressing through a more demanding range of movement. So we need to be strong in all ranges. So we might go to fatigue down here, to fatigue here, and then to fatigue higher up. So that's an example of shoulder strength that I think is a commonly given exercise, but sometimes is not done well. The example I want to give for stability, so like I said, shoulder strength is really important, but you need to be able to use the muscles very rapidly and in good coordination to give your shoulder the stability it needs. One way we do that is to use a slightly unstable implement. So kettlebell works really well, a dumbbell works really well, even a bottle of water, so there's a bit of movement can work really well at home. And once we've got shoulder strength, then what we can do is holding it like that incorporates your trunk, your forearm and your elbow, so the whole kinetic chain, and shoulder pressing in that position is going to automatically put a little bit of movement into the joint that has to be controlled. Okay, and you can do lots of variations in progression. So one of the things we do is we get them strong in this position, Then we get them to hold the weight above head while they walk forwards, backwards, eyes open, eyes closed, in and out of cones. And all those movements mean your shoulder joint has to stabilize in different positions. And hopefully you can see how shoulder strength is one facet, but shoulder stability is, although they're connected, they're two different parts that are really important. And the third thing with shoulder prehab or rehab, so we need to make sure we're doing shoulder strength, we're doing shoulder stability, and we're working on mobility. So the two common areas that are usually reduced with shoulders in terms of lack of flexibility is your thoracic spine and internal shoulder rotation. So I want to show you how to do a shoulder rotation stretch. Okay. So how we do a sleeper stretch. So lying on the side, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate over to anchor the arm, and they're going to internally rotate. Now it's really important this isn't painful because this can be an aggravating position for a shoulder. So we're going to rotate them as far as they can, and then what they're going to do is hold their elbow and pull it up. And what we're looking for is a stretch anywhere through the back of their shoulder. Now it's really important here to stretch through the back. It's not a pinching through the front. So I'll show you that again. So you're going to lie on their side, arm out in front of them, rotate forward so their arm doesn't move, add rotation first, just so they get a bit of a stretch. And then they're going to lift their arm up. And again, what we're trying to get is a stretch through the back part of the shoulder. Yeah, we can do that on both sides. So the three parts I think are important in shoulder prehab and rehab. Shoulder strength. So that could be any movement. The example I've shown is external rotation strength because it's very common. So shoulder strength, and it needs to be done really, really well, I think. So it needs to be cued. Your shoulder needs to be in a good position, and you need to be working until you fatigue, but not starting to compensate into different movements. So I think it's really important that it's done perfectly. Shoulder stability. So using that strength to be able to use your shoulder stability. So that's with movement. So different implements that move around, holding above head, eyes open, eyes closed, while you're walking around, and mobility of the rest of the chain. So that might be mobility of your shoulder joint, like I said, an internal rotation stretch, which is often tight, or thoracic spine rotation or extension, which can often be reduced as well. Now, I just want to go onto this shoulder strapping because this can take a little bit of time. So this is Jess, whose shoulder I'm going to strap. So so there's a number of ways to strap shoulders. I'm going to tape this how we do for training and for games. Specifically, it's a stability tape. So what's really important when we're doing stability tapes is the position we want to avoid is called the apprehension position. So it's a stop sign. So what we want to avoid is abduction and external rotation. So force in that position will push your humeral head forward, and it results in the anterior dislocation. It's the most common way that a shoulder is dislocated. So we need to make sure our tape does two things. It needs to give support to stop being in that position, and it also needs to give support to hold the humerus in the middle of the socket. So we're trying to do two things: centralize your humeral head and give support in this position. Now, if you've seen rugby league or uni, that's a common position to tackle in. So getting in this position needs to be where the tape is doing its most work, because that's the dangerous position for us. So they're going to start with their hand on their hip. So if we want to stop this movement, the most logical thing we do is we put them out of that movement to start, and then we strap them in that position. Now, if you work in AFL or some of our line-out lifters that need to get in this position, we might strap them up here so they've got a little bit more range up the top. So depending on the sport you work in is how you're gonna do that. I've pre-cut some under wrap, and we have a pre-cut at our training facility because it takes a little bit of time to cut. So this is the Elastoplast under wrap. You can use an adhesive spray. I won't tonight, but we'd use that for training and games. The under wrap is the fiddliest part for this, so it's easy to have it pre-cut. The first bit we're just going to put straight over the top of the shoulder. We're going to have two longer pieces, and what we're going to do is similar to where the tape's going to go. We're going to start at the front and wrap all the way around, and then we're going to do one at the back and wrap around. So we want to give the skin protection, but also give us somewhere to put the tape. So I tend to just break it all the way down first. And with shoulders, the easiest way is to then fold back, I don't know what that is, 10 centimeters. So this is the hardest part of a shoulder tape, is getting this bit right. So on the front, lift your arm out to the side, and we're just going to come around. Come on the top of the bicep. I'll show you this with the tape so it'll make more sense. So the same thing, I tend to break it all the way down before I do anything. Just fold back. So I've just got that same sort of space, and then we'll do the opposite direction, so we'll start at the back. And I can just slide that off as I come. It just makes it a bit more controllable. And then come underneath. Perfect. Okay. So then what you should have is automatically, because we're putting it on, rotating it will give it a little bit of support. So 38mm rigid tape. We're going for time. Plenty. Okay, so the first two bits, similar to an ankle or a knee, we're just going to put two anchors on. So front. Down to the back. The important thing here is we don't come too far up the neck, because it will limit lateral movement. And if you've ever worked in a contact sport, you'll know about stingers or burners. And sometimes what happens is when people get tackled and they compress their neck, they get symptoms all the way down their arms. They haven't hurt their arm, but they get neurological pain. One of the things that doesn't help is if you put tape too high, it goes through their upper trapezius, also impacts through their brachial plexus where the nerves come out. So you just need to make sure that you're mindful that you're staying away from that. So two anchors. Like I said, there's 2 points to our tape. So the first thing we want to do is you want to keep the humeral head in the middle of its socket. And the second thing we want to do is we want to stabilize this movement. So we don't want to have abduction and external rotation together. So we're going to do three rotations each way. So the first one, we're going to come from the front, and we're going to rotate around to the back. And what we're trying to do is pull this ball into the socket. So we're trying to get a force in this position. So we start around the bicep, and then we're going to pull back and up, and finish on the back where the anchors are. So I'll do a couple. And then I'll show you where it's going on the back. So the first one, we're starting underneath the bicep, coming up and pulling through. So we're going to do 3 of those. Now, the further we come down the front, the more stability there's going to be and the less movement there's going to be. So again, if we're working in a sport that doesn't need a lot of overhead movement and they've got a very unstable shoulder, we'll come a long way forward. If we're working with someone that needs to lift above here, we'll come a bit further back. So we'll do a second one of those, coming a little bit further forward. So again, underneath, pulling up. So that's 2. Now the third one, just to give it more support, we're going to do the same movement, but we're going to just add a bit more rotation. So we're going to start the same, we're going to start at the front, around the arm, and then come back up. Okay, so it's the same movement, we're just adding it, we're just starting a different spot. And what you'll see already is that starts to limit that movement a little bit. So it starts to tighten up. Now that's not enough yet, but the idea is we've pushed the shoulder joint into a safe position in the middle of the socket. So if you just spin around so I can show you back, and you can see where I finished is just kind of the back of the shoulder blade through there. So that's the first bit. Okay, you can see how that tape is forcing into the socket. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go from the back and we're going to pull front, and we're going to come the opposite direction. And again, this is going to limit us into this apprehension position. So coming around the front and finishing on those anchors again. So the same thing, we'll do 2 to start with, and then we'll do 1 that comes all the way around. Again, the lower we come down through the front of the humerus, the more movement we're going to stop. So that's 2. Then the third one, we're going to go all the way around. So we're going to start at the front. Now, I tend to stop it because if you just pull this as hard as you can, you tend to tourniquet the bicep. So the easiest way is to put your finger on it so you can control it, get some more tape off the roll. Add it on, same thing, you can stop it, get some more tape off, and then come around the front. And what you'll notice with this one specifically is that's really starting to limit how much you can rotate. So we're getting abduction, but we're not allowing rotation anymore. So I tend to do that, hold it there, then ask them to move their arms. So ask them to come up into that position and see if they want more support. If they want more, I'll do the same thing, but I'll come lower down on each side. If they're happy with that, then we can lock it off. So the next step we do, which is just because there's a lot of collisions in our game and there's a lot of force and the shoulder strapping needs to be strong and needs to stand up to a lot of force, we use an EAB, so a non-hand rippable tape, and we just overwrap it. So we start at the front, come all the way around. Finish at the back. And what that does, it gives us more support, so then when we get in a position that the tape is under load, so tackling here, for example, even if we get some ripping through the front of the tape, this tape will not rip and it will provide another layer of support. So we'll go there. And then we just lock all that off to hold it together. So another anchor. And then 2 smaller bits of under wrap as well. Which is just to hold the tapes together. Okay, so just go over that again. What we're trying to do is 2 things. So we're trying to make sure that we load the shoulder joint into the middle of the socket, and then that we give support coming up into abduction, external rotation. So once we do a couple of anchors, then we're looking at rotation tape to pull it up to start with, and then rotations to stop the external rotation. The position you do it is going to be how much support you get. So if we start quite low down, we're going to be more limited. If we take in this position, we'll end up with more range at the end, which is relevant depending on what the sport is. And then we tend to overwrap with an EAB to stop it ripping. Now, if you were in a sport that had needed more range, you might overwrap with a tearable tape. So the Leukovan Light or something like that is another option. Very good. So that's how we strap it. That's how we strap a shoulder at the Brumbies to stop instability. Okay, let me just move this off the screen. So, like I've said, I think there's a couple of important things with shoulders. So first of all, I think it's really important with our prehab and our rehab that we focus on shoulder strength, shoulder stability, and shoulder mobility. So the examples we talked about with shoulder strength were external rotation strength and doing it really, really well. So we're making sure that the shoulder exercises we do are being done perfectly. They're being done slowly to make sure we get time under tension. And then we make sure that we're progressing them by progressing shoulder strength through different ranges of movement so that we're able to do it. So the strength is able to be used where it's required. In terms of shoulder stability, we need to make sure that the strength we gain through exercises is being able to be used in the positions that we need it. So the muscles are strong, but they're also able to come on and off when we need them. So we talked about an overhead press using an implement that's a bit unstable. So an upturned kettlebell is something we use all the time. A dumbbell when you hold the end is something we use all the time. But even a milk bottle half full with water works quite well to try and put some differences into the system. And we can progress that by holding it overhead, walking forward or back, or even doing the exercise with eyes open and eyes closed. And we also spoke about the importance for mobility in the rest of the chain for shoulder injuries. So we need to make sure that the thoracic spine has enough range of movement and the shoulder has enough internal rotation. So an example is that sleeper stretch I showed you when you're lying on your side, rotated and lifting up. In terms of shoulder strapping, the position you do it is determines how much you limit the movement, and specifically we're looking at limiting abduction and external rotation because that's the most common position to have a shoulder dislocation. And we go with the Elastoplast underwrap to start with, and then we tape to hold into the joint and to limit rotation. So that's kind of the most important things with shoulders. So there's a question. So the question is, I play front row rugby union. Do props prefer different taping because of the contact? Which is a really important question. It's a really important question for a number of reasons. So if we talk about, I guess, rugby specifically, first of all, and I guess, so different positions in rugby require different demands. So if you think of a fullback versus a line-out lifter or a front rower, they have specific demands. What's really important is the shoulder strapping works for them. So let's give an example that makes a bit more sense. So a front rower in rugby union, if you're not aware, with the scrums, has specific areas their arm needs to get into to bind. So they need to have shoulder strength. The shoulder strapping needs to allow them to get in positions that they need to. If you look at somebody who's got an unstable shoulder, who's a line-out lifter, there's no point strapping them down here so they can't lift their arm up if they've got to lift another player above head. So I think that's relevant for different positions, but also different sports. So what the answer, I guess, that I'm slowly getting to is shoulder strapping sometimes takes some playing around, and you need to find a balance between taping them to stop their shoulder move too much, but allow them to do what they need to do. A really common one, again, is in AFL. If you look at ruckman in AFL, where they're constantly in this position for tapping the ball or marking, so you need to make sure that you're allowing the shoulder to get to it, but not past it. And there's a number of ways you can do that. So we can do it by, again, strapping them with different tape. So instead of using the non-rippable tape as an overwrap, you might use the Leukovan Light, so it allows a little bit more give. And you might tape them with less tape. You might tape them not as far down the front of their shoulder, and you might tape them in a position that's already up here. So I guess the answer is yes. So shoulder positions need different taping, and then when they have that, they need to make sure that they train with it first and they're comfortable. And then once they've done that, we can tweak it for games. So hopefully that answers that in a roundabout way. Okay, another question, which is very common in rugby. So if you have a player that prefers some padding to the taping, where would you put it? So a really, really common one, which is part of the question, is AC joints. So if you're not familiar with AC joints, so glenohumeral joint, AC joint sits on top. It's a really common injury to have from direct impact or landing on your side. They're very common in contact sports. They tend to be very painful for a long period of time. One of the treatment options is to put, and it's very common when guys come back to playing, is they end up having a guard that they sit over their shoulder that they play with. And the idea is it protects the joint and it dissipates some of the force. In terms of where to put it, I tend to strap the shoulder first, like you said, like you saw, all the way through to the end, and I put the AC joint on top, and then I put Elastoplast over wrap to hold it down on top of that. So shoulder strap completely first, start to finish, pad on top, and then tape or over wrap to hold it down after that. Another question has come through. So what type of questions would you recommend to ask a player when strapping their shoulder? It's a really good question, because I think there's one really, really important thing you need to know. You need to know a number of things, but there's one really important thing you need to know at the start, and I've seen this happen a lot of times at club football level, is why do they need their shoulder strapped? So if we go back to that other answer, if they're saying, oh, I've got a sore AC joints or something like that, there's no benefit to strapping someone to stop their movement if their lack of movement is not a problem. So I think the number one question is why do you need your shoulder straps? So if they say, oh, I need my shoulder strap because I feel comfortable when it's tighter and I get more stability, that makes sense, because then you can strap it to support them. But if they don't know why it needs to be strapped, it's probably a question why you're strapping it, obviously. But the most important difference is if they're talking about, I get some pain in my AC joint, for example, and I get my shoulder strapped, there's no point doing a strapping technique that limits their movement, because it's not going to do anything for them. So specifically with shoulder strapping there, we're looking at limiting movement and limiting stability. But that's a very good question. So if there's any more questions before we finish, we've got a couple of minutes left, shoot them through. Okay, so another one's come through. Would you recommend strapping post-shoulder dislocation? It's a tricky one to answer. I think, first of all, we need to assume that, so let's say you're coming back, we have to assume you've done a full rehabilitation after a shoulder dislocation and you've been cleared by everybody to play, which is really, really common. Yeah, so I think what we would tend to do is we would strap your shoulder definitely for training and games at the start for a number of reasons. It supports your shoulder in the position that you're most likely to get a common dislocation. So I think it is important that it's strapped in that position. I guess the second part is, do you strap it for the rest of the time you play? That's an individual preference. What commonly happens is people will strap it initially, and then they'll probably go back to playing, and they'll feel comfortable with the strapping because it gives them more support, and then they'll make a decision. For some people it's weeks, some people it's years down the track, that they'll either continue with it until they have a bad game and don't want it anymore, or they'll stop doing it. So I think, to answer your question, yes, you should strap it when you first return, and then how long you strap it for is probably dependent on personal preference. All right, so last question, and then we'll finish up. So the question is, do you ever use K-tape instead of rigid tape for shoulders? I do, but not for shoulder stability. So K-tape, and I know there's a presentation on Tuesday about kinesio tape. So this goes for kinesio tape, rock tape, dynamic tape, any tape that's a little bit movable. I think it's fantastic, and I use it for a lot of different techniques. I don't use it for shoulder stability, because what we're trying to use is rigid tape to stiffen up a joint. So I don't think it provides enough support to stiffen up a shoulder joint. So I know that if you do the course, they'll show you ways to do it, and I've seen those. For the job I do at the moment, which is big, strong footy players running into each other, it doesn't provide enough support for their shoulders. So yes, I think you can, but I don't at the moment. Okay, so we're just about out of time. So thank you everyone that's logged in for tonight. So that's week 4, session 7, so shoulders. I hope the session has been worthwhile, insightful, and useful. If you need more information, you can go to elastoplast.com or Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. Otherwise, I hope that's been useful. I hope you've got some tips that you can use. I think I'm back in next Thursday for another topic. But very good. So hope that's useful. Hope you've got some stuff to take away regarding shoulder strength and strapping.